Welcome to the debate. Imagine waking up in your underwear, right, in your own bed, only to find your landlord just, well, standing right there in your apartment.
That is just, it's a completely horrifying invasion of privacy.
Right? And they bypassed your lock using an emergency key, not because the building was on fire or, pipe burst, just to check a water meter.
Which is insane. And honestly, when you look at the facts of this specific case, that unauthorized entry, it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. Today, we are examining a highly volatile, really multi-layered tenancy conflict. We've got a tenant who has been renting a mixed-use loft since March 2017.
Yeah, and it's important to note it serves as both their residence and a commercial space.
Right. Specifically, it is the designated venue for an upcoming light art exhibition. Like, we're talking over 100 self-designed pieces. And the tension right now is it's incredible.
It's a total powder keg. The tenant is facing a resting eviction lawsuit from 2023.
Yep, and the landlord is demanding about 3,500 euros in disputed court costs. Meanwhile, the tenant has actually been paying their monthly rent, which is 960 euros, quote-unquote, under reservation for the last 19 months.
And you have to add in the severe, completely unaddressed structural defects. We are talking about documented toxic mold that's been growing since, July 2022?
July 2022, yeah. Plus missing safety railings and doors that don't even physically close properly.
Right. Yet, despite 3 separate expert companies confirming this mold, the landlord is just actively gaslighting the tenant. We have SMS messages dated just recently, May 19, 2026, where the landlord outright denies the illegal entry ever happened.
Yeah, and accuses the tenant of having mold paranoia.
Mold paranoia? It's ridiculous.
It really is. So the core question we are debating today is this. When you are faced with a bad faith counterparty in a legally precarious situation like this, what is the optimal resolution strategy?
Right.
I argue for, tactical de-escalation. I think the tenant should utilize these massive grievances strictly as leverage to secure a comprehensive out-of-court settlement. Basically, neutralize the acute risks to protect their ultimate goal, which is the art exhibition.
And I contend that against a landlord exhibiting this level of deceitful behavior, soft negotiation is actively dangerous. The tenant must assert maximal legal leverage, demand a massive retroactive rent reduction, and frankly, immediately institutionalize the conflict through health and building authorities.
Okay, so let's outline our respective positions here, starting with the reality of the tenant's current legal standing. My perspective is focused entirely on strategic risk mitigation, because this tenant is standing on a legal trapdoor.
You mean the eviction lawsuit?
Exactly. There is a resting eviction lawsuit, eine Rundräumungsklage in German law. What that means is the court has already processed an eviction, but it's currently paused.
Right, it's just sitting there.
Yeah, and right now, the tenant owes a mere 150 euros in acute rent arrears. But because of that paused eviction, that 150 euros is an existential threat. If the landlord reactivates that lawsuit, the tenant loses their commercial survival.
Sure, but
So, just to finish my thought, the primary objective here isn't punitive justice against the bad landlord. It is securing the physical space for the upcoming light art exhibition and locking in the sublease until September 2026.
okay, but you cannot secure a space by appeasing someone who operates entirely in bad faith. From my perspective, we have specific, undeniable evidence that this landlord just manipulates reality.
You mean the text messages?
Yes, the SMS messages from May 2026. When a landlord tells you in writing that documented mold is just paranoia, you cannot negotiate on the honor system.
Well, a settlement isn't exactly the honor system, it's a contract.
But a settlement requires some mutual trust, and this landlord has torched that trust. The tenant must formally establish objective power. You don't do that by trading away your strongest claims for a polite agreement.
I wouldn't call it polite.
You do it by unapologetically enforcing the law. The tenant needs to trigger official state interventions to force compliance and demand a 50 to 70% retroactive rent reduction. You have to bring a hammer to this negotiation.
Look, I completely understand the desire to bring a hammer when you've been wronged, and the tenant has incredibly strong claims. 19 months of rent paid under reservation, plus that unauthorized entry in May 2023.
Exactly.
But I view these as high-value currency, not weapons for a scorched earth war. You trade this currency in a zero-sum negotiation. The goal is to wipe out the landlord's €3,500 cost claims and secure formal, irrevocable consent for the gallery exhibition.
See, I look at that exact same currency, specifically the unauthorized entry, and I see a completely different utility. If we start by looking at that incident in May 2023, you're treating it like a bargaining chip you can just slide across a table.
Because legally, that's what it is now.
No, we need to look at the psychological and legal severity of what actually happened. The landlord completely bypassed the tenant's consent. They used an emergency key to enter the space and caught the tenant entirely vulnerable in their underwear.
It's awful, I agree.
In a mixed-use space that is both a home and a business, the inviolability of that space is absolute. That incident shouldn't be traded away. It should be weaponized right now to claim damages for personal distress and to establish a severe actionable breach of contract. It proves objectively that the landlord is untrustworthy.
I mean, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I don't disagree that it's a severe violation of privacy, but we have to look at the mechanics of how the law actually treats time.
What do you mean by that?
If you try to use a 3-year-old trespass as your primary offensive weapon in a new legal battle today, you are essentially trying to detonate a damp firework.
Why is it a damp firework?
The violation of the home is a foundational legal principle. It doesn't just evaporate. The principle doesn't know, but the legal mechanism to enforce it criminally certainly does. Under Section 123 of the German Criminal Code, the window to file a formal criminal complaint for trespass is 3 months.
Right, but...
And that window closed in August of 2023. If you march into civil court today in 2026 demanding damages for an event you didn't legally escalate 3 years ago, a judge is going to see right through it.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
You're entirely fixated on the criminal statute of limitations. The civil implications of a landlord secretly holding and using an unauthorized key are very much alive. The breach of trust isn't a one-off event from 2023. It is an ongoing, present-day threat.
But proving damages after 3 years is incredibly difficult.
It's not just about damages. By aggressively asserting this civil claim now, the tenant can demand a protective order. They can formally, legally revoke any right the landlord claims to have to hold a key.
You could get that same lock-change agreement in a quiet settlement.
But it's about establishing a documented, institutionalized history of landlord overreach. Think about it. If the landlord tries to activate that resting eviction later, what is the tenant's defense? If you settle quietly now, you have nothing.
You have the settlement agreement.
If you escalate now, you have a documented narrative of harassment and illegal entry to present to the judge. You institutionalize the conflict to protect yourself.
See, institutionalizing the conflict is exactly what worries me, because it invites unpredictable third parties into a very fragile ecosystem.
Unpredictable? I call it objective.
Well, if a landlord doesn't respect the physical boundary of a locked door, they certainly aren't going to respect the health boundaries of a mold-infested loft, which, brings us to the physical state of the space itself.
The mold.
Yeah. We have mold existing since July 2022. We have a missing safety railing. We have non-airtight doors that physically fail to meet the standard building envelopes.
Yes, specifically the DIN 41087 standards for airtightness. That detail is critical.
It is.
It means the doors physically allow moisture and drafts to enter the building envelope, which directly causes the mold. The landlord is blaming the tenant, sending texts about mold paranoia and implying the tenant just isn't ventilating the space properly.
Right. The classic, you're not airing it out right excuse.
Exactly. But the failure to meet that specific DIN standard physically proves it's a structural defect. It's the building's fault, not the tenant's lifestyle. And this is exactly where the tenant must stop playing nice.
I don't think anyone is suggesting playing nice.
But the landlord is literally denying reality. So you force reality upon them. The tenant must call the health department, the Gesundheitsamt,
and the building authority the bow off seat immediately.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently.
How so?
Well, if you bring in the building authority to inspect the roof and the doors, and the health department to inspect the toxic mold, aren't you handing the steering wheel of your life over to the state?
You are handing the assessment to an objective, irrefutable third party, which is exactly what you need when dealing with a gaslighter.
You're handing it to bureaucrats who operate on strict, uncompromising safety mandates. They don't care about your art exhibition.
They care about public health.
Exactly. Let's walk through the mechanics of what actually happens. An inspector from the health department walks in, sees toxic mold that has been growing for 4 years, and decides it is a severe respiratory hazard.
Which it is.
Right. Then the building authority looks at the missing safety railing in a commercial space meant to host public art viewers, and they pulled a permit. What happens if they declare the loft officially uninhabitable?
Then the landlord is legally compelled by the state to fix it immediately.
Or the space is condemned. The tenant is forced to evacuate. They lose the loft. They lose the commercial sublease they rely on.
That's a worst-case scenario.
But it's a very real one. And most importantly, the 100-piece light art exhibition, the culmination of years of work, is entirely destroyed. By inviting state authorities in to flex your legal muscles, you risk detonating the exact thing you are trying to protect. You entirely lose control of the timeline and the outcome.
Look, I understand the fear of state intervention. Condemnation is a theoretical risk. But living with toxic mold while paying €960 a month to a landlord who mocks you is an absolute current reality.
I'm not denying the reality of the mold.
But if you rely on private, out-of-pocket expert opinions, as the tenant has done so far, the landlord just continues to delay. They receive a private report and they send another text message denying it.
Yeah, the text from May 19th.
Exactly. Institutional pressure is the only language a recalcitrant landlord understands. When a state health inspector issues an official stamped record of toxic mold, it permanently shatters the mold paranoia narrative.
True, it does shift the burden.
The landlord can't text a government agency and tell them they are paranoid. It shifts the entire legal burden of proof onto the landlord. That is how you create real leverage.
But if you don't want to risk using the state as your hammer, what's left? The money. The financial mechanics are the tenant's true leverage, and it's a tool they entirely control.
Oh, I completely agree that the money is where the tenant has absolute superiority. Let's look at how the tenant has been paying rent.
Right.
They haven't just been handing over €960 a month. They've been paying it unter Vorbehalt, or under reservation, for 19 months. We need to explain why that is such a brilliant strategic move.
It really is.
Normally, if you keep paying full rent despite a defect like mold, the law assumes you've accepted the condition of the apartment. By formally declaring they are paying under reservation, the tenant prevents the landlord from evicting them for non-payment, but they legally preserve their right to sue and claw back all that money later.
It is a phenomenal defensive shield.
It's an incredible offensive weapon. The tenant has 19 months of rent legally primed for a clawback. When you combine the severe mold, the broken toilet lights, the missing motion sensors, and the severe vibration and noise from the construction site next door.
The Zeit Ariel construction noise, yeah.
Right. That noise. The tenant has grounds for a massive retroactive reduction. We are talking 50, maybe 70%.
That's a huge chunk of change.
Exactly. They could justify withholding thousands of euros right now. They can use that massive financial backlog to utterly crush the landlord's demand for the 3,500 euros in old court costs. You don't ask for a settlement. You dictate one because you hold the purse strings.
Okay, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores the razor-thin margin of error the tenant is operating within. You are completely forgetting the mechanics of the resting eviction lawsuit.
The eviction is resting. It is paused. It's not active.
It is a live landmine. That is what a resting eviction actually means. The trial phase, the hearings, the months of legal wrangling, that is all already bypassed.
Well, yes, the paperwork is done.
The paperwork is filed. The court is quite literally just waiting for a reason to stamp the final order. The reason it is paused is because the tenant previously caught up on their arrears. But right now, there is a €150 debt.
Right.
If the tenant suddenly decides to play financial hardball and arbitrarily withholds thousands of euros unilaterally, without a court-approved quota or a signed settlement agreement, they take their foot off the landmine.
But the defects are real. The tenant has the right to reduce rent.
The right to reduce rent is not the same as a legally finalized calculation.
Okay, fair.
If the tenant assumes they are entitled to a 50% reduction, but a judge later decides the mold only warranted a 20% reduction, the tenant is suddenly in massive illegal arrears.
Which triggers the eviction.
Because of that resting eviction, crossing the arrears threshold instantly triggers an extraordinary termination. The landlord won't even bother negotiating. They will just call the court, point to the withheld rent, and activate the eviction. You lose the gallery overnight.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the timing? I concede the danger of the resting eviction. It is the most sensitive variable here. In fact, I completely agree with you on one very specific tactical necessity.
Oh?
That €150 acute debt must be paid today.
Exactly. You have to disarm the landmine first.
You disarm the landmine today by paying the €150. You close that acute vulnerability, so the resting eviction cannot be triggered.
Right.
But tomorrow, the strategy diverges entirely. Tomorrow, the subsequent settlement offer must demand that massive retroactive reduction. You pay the €150 to neutralize the immediate threat, but you instantly follow up with the math for the past 19 months.
I see where you're going with this.
This demonstrates to the landlord that the tenant is negotiating from a position of absolute financial superiority, not desperation. You don't politely ask them to forgive their €3,500 in court costs. You show them the itemized math that proves they actually owe the tenant money.
Well, we are arriving at a similar destination, but we are utilizing entirely different philosophies to get there. You want to show them the math to dominate them, to punish the bad faith.
Absolutely.
I want to show them the math to create a highly controlled zero-sum trade. If we pull back and look at the whole picture, my stance remains that the smartest victory here is a quiet one.
Even with a landlord like this?
Even with them. Because the ultimate prize is not teaching a bad landlord a lesson. The prize is the light art exhibition. You neutralize the acute risks by paying that €150. Then you take those historical grievances, the damp firework of the 2023 trespass, the 19 months of mold, the construction noise, and you trade them entirely in exchange for future security.
Just trade them away?
You draft a settlement that wipes out the old court costs, guarantees the commercial sublease, and ensures the exhibition can proceed unhindered. Everything else, the anger, the mold, the key, is just currency you spend to buy the gallery's survival.
And my summary is that bad faith actors inherently exploit compromises. When a landlord lies in writing about toxic mold, lies about sneaking into your apartment, and holds a resting eviction over your head to force compliance, a quiet victory is an illusion.
I think it's practical.
True security only comes from uncompromisingly asserting your rights. You must establish objective proof of the defects through state authorities. And you must demonstrate a total willingness to leverage your financial power.
But the risk?
If you settle too softly, if you just trade away your leverage for a piece of paper, a bad faith landlord will simply find another entirely new excuse to undermine you before the exhibition even opens. Deterrence is the only language they respect.
Well, despite our starkly different approaches to negotiation, we have found some vital points of convergence in the details of this case. First, we both completely agree on the mechanics of the immediate danger.
The €150.
Right. The current €150 debt is a live landmine. It must be paid immediately, explicitly under reservation, to defuse the resting eviction trap. You simply cannot negotiate complex settlements with a loaded gun to your head.
Completely agreed. And I think the second major point of convergence is the power of the 2017 lease itself. Looking closely at the contract, the fact that this is a mixed-use lease that explicitly outlines the space as a mounting and exhibition room for self-designed light objects is the tenant's absolute strongest shield.
It really is.
The landlord knew exactly what the space was for. This legally protects the upcoming exhibition and makes it vastly more difficult for the landlord to push the tenant out under standard, simplified residential eviction protocols.
Yeah, it really highlights the incredible tension between theoretical legal rights and practical commercial realities. The law might say you are 100% justified in waging a multi-year war over a trespass and mold.
Which they are.
But commercial reality dictates that pushing that war to the limit might physically cost you your art gallery.
And the case study we're examining offers even deeper tactical steps for structuring these exact types of high-stakes, multi-layered negotiations. There are detailed, standardized formulas for calculating those retroactive rent reductions based on specific DIN standard failures that we honestly barely had time to scratch the surface of today.
Oh, there is always more to explore when human behavior and contract law collide. We started today by talking about waking up to a landlord in your bedroom and how a tenant navigates the fallout when every boundary is broken.
It is a deeply uncomfortable scenario, but hopefully we've shown how understanding the underlying mechanics of your legal leverage can at least help you navigate the chaos.
Absolutely. We will leave it to the listener to decide which path they would take when the stakes are this high. Do you choose the quiet, strategic settlement to protect your ultimate commercial goal?
Or do you uncompromisingly enforce your legal rights to ensure a bad faith actor can never threaten your home again?
It is the ultimate choice between the art of the deal and the uncompromising letter of the law.
That it is.
Thank you for joining us on